Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I beg to move the motion in my name on the order paper. I am grateful to the Backbench Business Committee for agreeing to this debate today, and I am also extremely grateful to my co-sponsor, the Honourable Member for St Albans, as well as the 73 members who supported this debate application. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Rohingya Muslim minority in Myanmar have been the subject of decades of segregation and racial discrimination. Over the last few years, they have repeatedly been indiscriminately targeted by the Burmese military, and in the last month, they have witnessed human rights violations on a scale extreme even by standards of Myanmar's history. Following the attack on the 25th August on government buildings by the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, the Burmese military led by Min Aung Hlaing have been responsible for attacks that have led to over 582,000 Rohingya Muslims, according to the UNHCR, fleeing for their lives by crossing the border to Bangladesh. There are now almost 1 million refugees in Bangladesh, Rohingya refugees, joining this recent number joining 400,000 that had already fled there following previous periods of targeted attacks, notably in 2012 and 2016. There is a further new influx of refugees from Myanmar who are being driven out of Rakhine State because food markets in the west of the region have been shut down, with crucial aid deliveries restricted. The UNHCR today said that between 10 to 15,000 Rohingya people have been stranded since Sunday night in the Anjuman-Para border crossing point between Bangladesh and Myanmar. These border pathways are particularly dangerous, with Amnesty International accusing the Myanmar government of laying landmines in the path of fleeing women and children only a few weeks ago. Last week, the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for the UN published its rapid response mission from Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. A team of 3 were deployed to Bangladesh in September following the reports of deadly violence and the grave human rights abuses committed by the military on the 25th of August and onwards. The UN team conducted 65 interviews with many refugees who had recently crossed the border. The UN's job was to establish the facts about what was happening in northern Rakhine. And their report, Mr. Deputy Speaker, makes uncomfortable reading. After the attacks by the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, the military entered into what it calls as a clearance operation. Unimaginable violations of human rights have taken place during this time, and according to the UN team, several victims reported the killing of close family members by random gunfire or referred to the Myanmar security forces surrounding villages at some distance and then shooting indiscriminately at houses and individuals alike. The report also details witness accounts that attest to Rohingya victims, including children and elderly people being burnt to death inside their houses. As the UN mission progressed and the team spoke to more women and girls, horrific accounts of sexual violence were shared. Girls aged as young as 5 or 7 years, according to the report, were raped, often in front of their relatives and sometimes by 3 to 5 men taking turns, all dressed in army uniforms. The report goes on to detail accounts of summary executions, cases of torture and disappearances. Alongside these horrendous human rights violations are accounts of forced displacements and destruction of religious and cultural buildings and other items. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank Deputy Speaker for allowing me to speak. I have given evidence in these kind of situations. Can I ask the Honourable Lady whether these war crimes are now being put forward by the United Nations for prosecution, because they should start now. Right now.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for raising the issue, and I couldn't agree more. And I hope that the Minister will take this point today as one of the action points of our government to build on the leadership that it is showing. And we would like to see this item on the agenda. If I can make a bit more progress. Mr. Deputy Speaker, It is this report that backs up the statement made by the High Commissioner of Human Rights in his opening statement of the 36th session of the Human Rights Council that the situation in Myanmar is a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. This builds on the call by Yan Hee Lee earlier in the year for a UN Commission of Inquiries, which the Burmese government refused to cooperate with. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I'm extremely grateful, and I apologise for intervening at that point, but earlier in Foreign and Commonwealth Office questions, I did ask the Minister, a good Minister, to comment on the textbook definition of ethnic cleansing. I believe he went further than the UK government has gone before in saying that it was moving towards that situation. Does she agree that in order for the UK to have legitimacy on this topic, it should back up the UN's assessment that this is a textbook case of ethnic cleansing?
I think my honourable friend, I do very much hope that our government will back this definition up. The House will be aware that in 1993, the final report of the Commission of Experts established following the UN Security Council resolution of 780 defined ethnic cleansing as, I quote, a purposeful policy designed by one ethnic or religious group to remove by violent and terror-inspiring means the civilian population of another ethnic or religious group from certain geographic areas. This is the textbook definition to which the motion refers and against which we must measure what is happening in Myanmar. The question is therefore, do the events in Burma amount to a purposeful policy? Are violent and terror-inspiring means being used? Is a specific ethnic or religious group being removed from certain geographical areas? The answer, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is yes to all of the above. We are witnessing a deliberate state-sponsored policy of terror, murder, arson, rape and torture designed to remove the Rohingya people from their homes. There is now such an overwhelming weight of evidence of ethnic cleansing that members of this House cannot fail to agree, nor can the government. It is vital that members of this Parliament, which is seen as a beacon of democracy in the world, sends a powerful message today that we will stand with the people who are being persecuted, the Rohingya population and other minorities in Myanmar. I give way to my honourable friend.
I congratulate the honourable member on securing this debate and on her powerful contribution. Does she agree with me that we welcome the government's action in relation to stopping the support for the training of military personnel? Does she also feel that the government should review all other programmes that it funds through DFID and elsewhere to pause those programmes whilst we reflect on how best to respond to the ethnic cleansing which she has so powerfully described?
I thank my honourable friend. I believe that all humanitarian efforts should be retained and pressure on the government for access should be retained, and other non-essential programmes should be reviewed with a view to looking at what we can do to bring an end to the violence, but also to bring a longer-term solution that brings peace in that region, but also the protection of the Rohingya minority and other minorities in Myanmar. I'm just going to make a bit more progress. As the co-chair of the all-party group on Burma, I have been aware of the discrimination and mistreatment of the Rohingya people that they have endured for decades in Myanmar. In 2013, following a series of violent clashes in 2012, which left over 100,000 people internally displaced, I visited Myanmar with Refugees International and the Burma Campaign. During this visit, I heard stories of how Rohingya communities had fled violent attacks to remote areas of the countryside. And in Rakhine State, the camps where Rohingya people had been forced to live in were horrific, with little or no access to humanitarian aid or access to healthcare. Some of that pressure was relieved, but with limited access to agencies, international agencies. I travelled by boat to a UNHCR-supported camp in Paktau and have vivid memories of the shores near the camps being covered in faeces with dead rats floating just metres away from children who were bathing to keep cool in unbearable heat. I remember being told stories of loved ones being killed, of children dying due to a lack of healthcare, and women dying due to lack of support during childbirth. I'll give way.
Can I congratulate the Honourable Lady on her speech so far? I think it is something that everybody on all sides of the House can agree with. I just hope that she would be encouraged by a statement that was put out in the Council of Europe last week, where we had a plenary session where the Political Affairs Committee, of which I am a member, put out a statement condemning the action and calling all Council of Europe member states, all 47 states, to help with the humanitarian relief effort and to support both Burma and Bangladesh, which I hope shows that this goes much wider than this House, and it's a huge international community effort behind it.
Well, we need very short interventions. I want to get everybody to have a fair chance to speak in this debate. It's a very important debate. Rushanara.
Thank you. I'm grateful for that intervention, and I very much hope that other governments will add their support to the humanitarian effort. The UN has stated over £440 million is required, and only a fraction of that has been raised. So I hope our government will encourage other governments, both in the European Union as well as in the wider international community, to provide more assistance to the humanitarian effort, both within Rakhine but also and especially in Bangladesh and other neighbouring states that are dealing with over 1 million refugees now. Mr. Deputy Speaker, much of the forced segregation stems from the Citizenship law of 1982, which lays out that full citizenship in Myanmar is based on being a member of the national races, a category awarded only to those who are considered to have settled in Myanmar prior to 1824, the date of the first occupation by the British. In Myanmar's national census of 2014, the Muslim minority group was initially allowed to self-identify as Rohingya, but the government later reversed this freedom and deemed that they could only be identified as Bengali, which they do not accept as they are not Bengali. I'll give way to the Honourable.
The Honourable Lady makes an extremely good point on the nationality issue, except that the British government have shown to the government in Naypyidaw evidence kept in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office which refers to a Muslim population in that part of what is now Burma, going back many hundreds of years.
I'm grateful to the honourable member and former minister for that intervention, as it clarifies the misconception that the Rohingya population have no right to be there and they're somehow refugees from the neighbouring Bangladesh. 8 months before polling day, the President of Myanmar revoked all temporary registration cards, leaving many Rohingya Muslims without any form of identity and hence unable to cast their vote during the transition towards democratic elections. And despite Aung San Suu Kyi's election victory, and despite her renowned campaigns as a human rights and pro-democracy campaigner, and her own sacrifice and fight for democracy for her fellow countrymen and women, many have expressed grave disappointment at her failure to speak out and raise her voice for the persecuted minorities of her country, and in particular of the Rohingya population. I share that sadness and disappointment as someone who, like many in this House, grew up admiring her fight for democracy and her courage. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, alongside that disappointment, we need to channel our focus on the military government, which controls the balance of power, which holds control of the military, the defence, the policing and other aspects of power, local government, the civil service and much else. And while the media rightly focuses attention on such an important figure, international figure in Aung San Suu Kyi, let us not let the military and the general off the hook. Let us hold the civilian government as well as, and in particular, the military to account. I'll give way briefly, and then I'm going to have to conclude.
She's been very generous in giving way. Just on the point of the military, could she set out for me what she thinks should be the safeguards that the British government applies before it resumes at some point in the future funding for military training in Myanmar?
I will come on to that, because I'm grateful to the government that in response to 170 parliamentarians urging for greater humanitarian assistance, the government has stepped up and has increased humanitarian assistance by 25 million, and also increasing the match funding to the Disaster Emergency Committee appeal, which we are all grateful to. But the parliamentarians asked for a suspension of the training, and I think it was right to do so, especially given there is no reference, to my understanding, of human rights training or awareness or attempts to change the behaviour of the military, and it would be wrong to reinstate it until we see progress. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Annan Commission reported the need for reconciliation and action to deal with the issues that have been affecting the Rohingya population and the wider population that is impoverished in Rakhine. And sadly, the publication of that report coincided with the so-called operation by the military that has led to this latest crisis. That suggests that the military, far from wanting a constructive solution and reconciliation and progress, is doing quite the opposite. This is a commission that was commissioned and led and supported by Aung San Suu Kyi. It has been undermined by the actions of the military, which says a great deal about their underlying objective, which is to undermine her, and she, of course, isn't helping herself, as many would say. But let us not forget that they have been instrumental in directing these attacks. The international community needs to apply pressure on the military. To do that, we seriously need to consider, and our government needs to consider, a global embargo, arms embargo of the Burmese military, building on what we have done domestically and with our European partners. It is not going to work to wring our hands and say, ethnic cleansing has gone on, and it has gone on before, if we don't follow it with courage, with the courage of our convictions, and act and apply pressure on the Burmese military. It is no longer acceptable to say the transition to democracy will stop the military from acting the way they have done. In fact, they haven't, and they are undermining the transition to democracy and undermining the civilian-led government led by Aung San Suu Kyi. It is imperative that the international community does more to support the humanitarian effort and, in particular, humanitarian access within Rakhine State. I visited Rakhine State in February this year once again, and it was shocking, the lack of access still for those who are desperately in need of food and healthcare in the internally displaced camps. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I am grateful to have the opportunity to raise these issues, and I very much hope that our government will continue, as it has done, in building on the tradition of being the country that speaks up for communities that have suffered, particularly in this case. Britain has a unique responsibility because of our colonial legacy, because of our interests in Myanmar. We all want that country to succeed and thrive. We all hoped that the transition to democracy would be a new chapter. Sadly, these series of attacks, particularly after the elections, has left many of us with grave doubts about that transition, and we must do everything we can to bring an end to the violence, to increase access, but most importantly to hold the Burmese military to account. So I call on the government to seek that global embargo and to apply pressure on our international partners to act, because we cannot once again allow ethnic cleansing to happen. We must learn the lessons of what happened in Rwanda, in Bosnia and elsewhere. We cannot come back to this House and say never again when we have watched ethnic cleansing happen and will regret not taking greater action and using all the powers and influences that we all have here in this House. Thank you.